Hey, welcome everyone. I'm Stan Sklarov, the Dean of Arts and Sciences, and it's a pleasure to introduce tonight's lecture. But first, I want to honor the legacy of Howard Zinn, who was a BU professor for many years. And some of his students are here tonight. Howard Zinn, yes, raise your hand if you were one of his students, like bravo. Howard Zinn was a longtime professor in BU's Department of Political Science, indeed from 1964 to 1988. He was a historian, an author, a professor, playwright, and a political activist of some renown. He wrote dozens of books focused on issues including race, class, war, and history. He's best known for his 1980 book, A People's History of the United States. Throughout his life, Professor Zinn fought for peace and human rights, for equality for those whose stories hadn't been highlighted. Professor Zinn had a lasting influence on his students, who often recount that he changed their lives and their perspectives. And I'll just say a little note about that. When I go on the road and meet alumni around the world, around the country, and I ask them, who was the professor who had the most impact on them and the way they see the world today, the way they approach their lives and their purpose? The number of people who mention Howard Zinn as one of the most important faculty that they encountered at Boston University, one of the most important figures, formative figures in their lives, Howard Zinn is on that, near the top or at the very top of the list. So it's a wonderful way to honor his legacy today. I'd like to thank the donor who has sponsored tonight's event and has sponsored the series. We're fortunate to be here tonight thanks to the generous support of Alex McDonald, who together with his late wife, Dr. Maureen Stafford, established the endowment that helps fund this lecture series. The lecture was established to continue Professor Howard Zinn's legacy by inviting distinguished speakers who embody and advance his ideals. Tonight, we are delighted to welcome Dr. Jelani Cobb, Dean of Columbia Journalism School, as this year's lecturer. Like Zinn, Dr. Cobb is a professor, an historian, storyteller, advocate, and an important participant in public discussion of history and of contemporary issues. And like Zinn, he has and continues to inspire generations of students. To get things started, it's my pleasure to introduce our moderator for today's event, Professor Louis Chude-Soke. He's a distinguished professor of English and holds the George and Joyce Wein Chair in African American and Black Diaspora Studies. Currently, he also serves as the director of African American and Black Diaspora Studies. Professor Chude-Soke is an accomplished writer and scholar. His notable works include the award-winning book, The Last Darky, Bert Williams, Black on Black Minstrelsy, as well as Sound of Culture, Diaspora and Black Technopoetics, and his memoir, Floating in a Most Peculiar Way. In addition, he is the editor of The Black Scholar, one of the premier journals in Black studies in the United States. Professor Chude-Soke has collaborated with a variety of artists and performers, including the renowned Berlin electronic duo Moose on Mars, with whom he produced the acclaimed album Anarchic Artificial Intelligence in 2021. He was also the lead artist and curator of Sometimes You Just Have to Give It Your Attention, a sonic archiving project that received the prestigious Kulturstiftung des Bundes Award from the German Federal Cultural Foundation in 2020. Looking ahead, Lewis's forthcoming book, Machines of Flesh and Blood, Race and the Making of Artificial Intelligence, is set to be published by Viking Press in 2025. please join me in welcoming Professor Louis Chude-Soke to the podium.
Thank you, Stan. Thank you, Stan. I've never been able to pronounce that award myself, so. Thank you, folks, all the folks in the house, but also the significantly more people that are watching online. Jelani Cobb is the author of Substance of Hope, Barack Obama and the Paradox of Progress. Also, To the Break of Dawn, a freestyle on the hip-hop aesthetic, among other books. He is the Dean of the Columbia School of Journalism, a longtime staff writer at The New Yorker, and an editor at The New Yorker's anthology, an editor of The New Yorker's anthology, The Matter of Black Lives. He was prominently featured in Ava DuVernay's Oscar-nominated documentary, 13th, and was the correspondent for two critically acclaimed PBS Frontline documentaries, Policing the Police and Whose Vote Counts. He has received a Peabody Award, the Hillman Prize for Opinion and Analysis Journalism, and the Walter Bernstein Award from the Writers Guild of America. So please, folks, along with me, let's welcome Dr. Jelani Cobb.
Good evening. It's too cold outside to be chilly in here. So good evening. Good evening. Thank you. I want to thank Dean Sklarov and Professor Chude-Soke for that introduction. I'm very happy to be here tonight. Before I get into the substance of my talk, I thought it would be good to just ground with a couple of parallels and a couple of convergences between my life and the life of Professor Zinn, whom I never had the pleasure of meeting. We did, however, share a biographical detail in that both he and I were at one point professors in and then chairs of the Department of History at Spelman College. And you know, in reading his memoir and also knowing a little bit about what he left out of the memoir, you know, I can say that in both of our instances, our time at that institution was an educational experience. And so, you know, significantly, one of the other points, one of the reasons I was really excited when I got this invitation, was the fact that when I became chair of the department, which required a little bit of coaxing from the provost, and we were kind of going back and forth on what I wanted if I took on the responsibilities of being chair. High on my list was that I wanted the college to support me in the creation of an annual Howard Zinn lecture. And that project, that idea was kind of underway, but then I was also recruited away and left for another institution. And unfortunately, that was one of the things that was left on the drawing board when I departed. And so it's fitting in some way that all these very many years later, I've come to Boston to speak at another institution that was so central and so formative and so important in his life, and a place where he indeed was equally important to the community. So I'll jump into this. There are three parts of this talk. I promise I will not talk excessively long, but this conversation or this discussion will be divided into three parts. One is called, well, we'll just kind of get to them as we get to. The first is the American evasion of democracy. Excuse me. I'm keenly aware, indeed all of us are, that this conversation takes place on the cusp of a contentious presidential election. We are, many of us, accustomed to hearing the old political adage of any presidential election, this is the most important election of your lifetimes. And unfortunately, for the last 3 election cycles, that statement has had a kind of renewed resonance. Indeed, the stakes are not simply matters of policy or culture or general direction or our particular orientation toward one part of the world or another. The stakes in these elections have been discussed in existential terms. And not from simply the kind of most radical or the most easily provoked corners of American opinion, but from more staid voices, such a centrist figure as Joe Biden, who discussed in the 2020 election saying that democracy was on the ballot. We have heard similar language used this time, and for very many reasons, that appears to be the case. One of the presidential contenders, Donald Trump, has made alarming statements for anyone who is concerned about the future of democracy. And I should say that these, over the course of the evening, I will make some points regarding this. I'm not making partisan criticisms. I, by and large, had the same criticisms of Donald Trump when he was a Democrat. I think it's true. And I'll get into some of the significance of that a little bit later in the conversation. But on a more fundamental level, statements like, the idea that he would be a dictator for one day or that he would weaponize the federal bureaucracy in service of seeking revenge on people whom he's deemed his enemies, his desire to weaken the influence and the independence of the press, the fact that neutral arbiters of kind of democratic practice have recognized in the United States what people refer to as backsliding, a democratic backslide. And so all these things have raised the concern and certainly raised the level of anxiety in the population on the cusp of this election. It's been 9 years since Donald Trump emerged in public life, since he came down the gold-colored escalator in Trump Tower and announced himself to be a candidate of the United States for the United States, presidency of the United States. We are also speaking just on the other side of the rally that took place in Madison Square Garden that even prior to its, at the moment of its announcement, in fact, was compared to the 1939 rally of the German-American Bund, one of the most significant, although not the only, kind of enduring moment of popular support for one variety of fascism or another in American life. Indeed, one of the uncomfortable dynamics that we have to confront in looking at the complexities of our particular moment is the long lineage of anti-democratic political behavior and the kind of genetic inheritance that we have received that has kind of flared up in the contemporary world. But in 2015, it's worth remembering that within 24 hours, in one 24-hour period, Donald Trump came down that escalator and announced himself to be a candidate for the presidency. And in doing so, he cited a number of reasons, but primary among them was the idea that the country was beset by Mexican rapists. And 24 hours later, and I should be hazard to point out that I do not assert there to be any causal relationship between these two dynamics. In fact, I believe that both of these dynamics are related to a bigger question of the zeitgeist of that moment. But within 24 hours, a 21-year-old South Carolinian by the name of Dylan Roof entered the sanctuary, actually the basement of the Emmanuel AME Church on Calhoun Street in Charleston, South Carolina. and shot 9 people. In the course of this murder spree, he fired upon a young man, 23 years old, by the name of Tywanza Sanders. Mr. Sanders fell to the ground. We have the account of his last moments because his mother, who was also present, witnessed what transpired. She survived the shooting because she lay in a pool of blood and placed her body over the body of her granddaughter. And her granddaughter, who was 10 or 11 years old. And she laid on top of her in order to protect her from Dylann Roof's murderous intentions. And it succeeded. But it also meant that she had to suffer the most terrible fate that any parent could imagine, which is that she saw her son injured and dying and could not go to him to help. That she had a kind of brutal Sophie's choice moment in which she, in order to save the life of her 12-year-old or her 11-year-old granddaughter, had to watch her son's last moments. Or as she later said in court transcripts, she said that she watched her son take his first breaths and she watched him take his last breaths. After he'd been shot, however, Mrs. Sanders said to Dylann Roof, we mean you no harm. Why are you doing this? You don't have to do this. Dylann Roof responded that he did have to do it because, quote, black men were raping white women and taking over the world. And so twice, within a 24-hour span, we had this language of the protection of presumably white women from the menace of dark-complexioned men, cited as a rationale for an action. In one instance, it was murderous. In one instance, it was political, and some might say implicitly so. And so this is the moment, the natal moment at which Trumpism takes form, which it is, comes into existence in the world. If we look now at the kind of bookmark moment on the other side of this, the other side of this is what transpires on January 6th, 2021. In the attempt to prevent the certification of the election and the standard ritual of the Electoral College in the tradition of nonviolent transfer of power in the United States. And this is disrupted for the first time. There's been lots of instances of people disrupting voting behavior, but the actual transition of power, that begins with John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, has happened successively and succinctly and generally bureaucratically and quietly until this particular year. It's worth remembering what was happening in 2015 and thinking about, in order to kind of get a vantage point of it, I, as a person who is both a historian and a journalist, I tend to find it most fruitful to move back and forth in time, to look at the modern and the contemporary in the context of what's happened before. And so, a century earlier, in 1915, we saw the 50th anniversary of the end of the Civil War. This was marked culturally in lots of different ways, lots of different reflections and authors and books and articles, but most fundamentally, it was marked by the release of a film called Birth of a Nation. Birth of a Nation is released in 1915. It is a classic of American cinema. It's also one of the great renderings of white supremacy in American cultural life. The film is disturbing on multiple levels. It lionizes the Ku Klux Klan. It presents the legislators, the black legislators who took office during the Reconstruction period as lazy, ignorant, foolish, lascivious, a general civic threat. It is egregiously and almost satirically racist. But I would contend that people who have ever seen that film or know what the film is about tend to get upset about the wrong thing. The problem with Birth of a Nation is not what it says about the past. There have been lots of attempts to distort the past, particularly as it related to Reconstruction, some of which we will talk about later in this conversation. But its diagnosis and its predictions about the future. He's dead wrong about the historical part. D.W. Griffith is dead wrong about the historical part. He is stunningly and disturbingly accurate in the predictive part about the future. Well, what was he predicting? The plot of that film holds that the lingering fractures of the Civil War, the division between North and South, as reflected in the two families, the Stonemans and the Camerons, that these lingering antagonisms can be cemented through their mutual contempt for the Negro. And this is the thing that North and South, the distant and fractured fraternal relationship, that fracture can be healed once all parties recognize that their common problem is the Negro. Birth of a Nation, the film, inspires the resurrection of the Ku Klux Klan. Very many people know this. It takes place in Stone Mountain, Georgia, and as a testament to the DNA of that film and its relationship to the resurgence of the Ku Klux Klan, we see the emergence of the ritual of the burning cross. The Ku Klux Klan was founded initially in 1866 in Tennessee in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War as a militia, a military group intent upon the white supremacist subordination of the newly emancipated slave population, formerly slave population of black people. This is their objective. There's no iconography of a burning cross. In fact, D.W. Griffith, as any director would in his context or in the modern context, is thinking about an arresting visual image, a way that he can convey the literally burning passion of these militants who are intent upon reclaiming the South for white people. And he strikes upon the burning cross as an image. And so this cross becomes a part of the Klan's iconography straight from D.W. Griffith's imagination. And so in the context of 1915, however, the emergence, re-emergence of the Ku Klux Klan is tailored to the antagonisms of that moment. Unlike the singularly focused first iteration of the Klan, the second iteration of the Klan is concerned with a broader set of antagonisms. They hate Jews. They hate immigrants. They hate Catholics. And of course, they maintain their contempt and hatred for black people. And so for a very bad pun, whenever I would talk with my students, I would say, what was the difference between the first Klan and the second Klan? And I'd say the second Klan was more Catholic in its hatreds. There, okay. I'll see myself out. This zeitgeist finds fruition, its full flower in 1924. In the midst of the eugenicist movement to sterilize all populations that are seen as unfit for reproduction, the nation passes the Johnson Immigration Restriction Act, same year that Howard Zinn is born. And this contempt for others, for people from abroad, people who are not considered American, people who lack that fundamental quality that will allow them to be part of the fabric of a democratic society, is embodied, is codified in this law, which specifically restricts the number of people who can come from less desirable places. And these are less desirable places in Europe, much less the rest of the world. And so it is passed in reaction to the 40 years of relatively open immigration from Europe that preceded it, between 1880 and 1920, the period in which most white Americans trace their ancestors coming to the United States. By 2015, at the moment in which we see the emergence of this euphemistically referred to populist surge, we are in the midst of a similar kind of allergic reaction, this time in response to the 1965 Immigration Reform Act. There's a 41-year period in which American immigration is dominated by this idea, this eugenic idea of protecting the stock and protecting the bloodline. And so when we hear the language from Donald Trump of groups that are polluting the American bloodline, it harkens back to this same sort of language. And so in 1965, we see the Immigration Reform Act of that year, legislation that is very much impacted by the zeitgeist of the civil rights movement and the influence of the civil rights movement, that liberalizes immigration laws and changes literally the complexion of the American society. Now, immigrants who come from Asia, who come from Latin America, who come from the Caribbean, who come from Africa, who come from places, who come from the Middle East, places that would, by and large, have been prohibited from sending immigrants into the United States under the old dispensation. I'm from Queens. Oh, seriously, it's a Queens person back there. Cool, we always find each other. I feel bad, sorry about the Mets. We didn't do it. And then apparently the Yankees won't do it either. I know, yeah, no. I did not expect, for the record, I did not expect sympathy, from this crowd. But so that's significant. And I don't want to get into this because it will become a whole conversation in itself. But I will take a momentary detour to point out one fundamental fact that if you understand it, everything else makes sense. If you do not understand it, lots of things will not make sense. And that is to say, I grew up in Queens, and Queens is statistically speaking the most diverse county in the United States. More than 400 languages spoken there. When I grew up, Queens was very much kind of a backwater of New York City. No one came there unless it was to go to the airport. But in recent years, Queens has become a tourist destination, largely because people realize that you can get food from all over the world prepared by people who are from that place. And it reflects, in my personal biography, which is that I played baseball in high school. And when I go back through the lineup, I was a right fielder. The left fielder was South Asian. His family was Sikh. Center fielder was Colombian. Center fielder was Puerto Rican. The second baseman was Jewish. Shortstop was Colombian. Catcher was Jamaican. We looked like the United Nations, taking the field. We also sucked. But that wasn't the important thing. The important thing was that, we were engaged in this fundamentally American ritual together. That's the Queens that I grew up in. Donald Trump grew up in Queens a generation before I did, when Queens was the second whitest part of New York City. Queens was so segregated that when Jackie Robinson purchased a home there, a cross was burned to let him know that this is Jackie Robinson of the Dodgers. A cross was burned to let him know that he was not welcome LaGuardia Airport was segregated, functionally segregated, not with white and colored signs, but if you were a black person, you were sent to one waiting area for a flight. If you were a white person, you were sent to a different one. And so this is kind of long legacy of housing segregation and racial restrictions and racial covenants in Queens. The difference between Trump's time growing up in Queens and mine is the 1965 Immigration Reform Act. The changes that eventually transformed the landscape of American demography first became visible in Queens, New York. My theory for this is that both of the airports are in Queens. And so I was talking with a friend of mine who's a journalist. Her parents immigrated from India, and she would tease them about coming 7,000 miles to get to America, but then landing and refusing to go more than 5 miles from the airport when they got here. Like, oh, okay, well, this is America. Good, I'm here. But that demography changed rapidly. And for one set of people, they embraced this, and they saw this as a kind of welcome change. For another set of people, however, the reaction was to circle the wagons, to wonder, who are these people? What God are they praying to? What food are they eating? What language is that they're speaking? And it became a kind of article of resentment, so much so, and so apparent, that in the 1970s, the television producer Norman Lear created a television show called All in the Family, in which he depicted a character named Archie Bunker, who was a kind of bewildered bigot surrounded by rapidly changing times, and it was set where? In Queens, New York. And so it's not coincidental that the most xenophobic modern American politician is a product of the most culturally diverse county in the country. Like, those two things are, wed, they're, related. And so not only this, but it reflects this fundamental anxiety and the fundamental context of American anti-democracy. The American evasion of democracy has consistently been a product of American anxiety about demography. I could talk about this for the rest of the night, but we won't get to Howard Zinn. One thing that, my last point on this before I move on, however, is this. Many of us remember learning about the 1798 Alien Act in school. If you learned it the way I learned it, the Alien Act, you just learned that the Alien Act changed the amount of time it took to become a citizen from 5 years to 13 years. Inert information, dry, bureaucratic details. What I did not learn, however, was that John Adams, the Federalist president, by 1798 was well aware that he would face Thomas Jefferson in the election of 1800 for the presidency. And the Federalist Party had a base which was fairly elite and fairly prominent in the northern part of the country. Thomas Jefferson and his newly developing Jeffersonian Democratic Party had a base that was much broader, and it was very popular among what they would have called the yeomanry, or the small farmers, and immigrants. And so in changing the time it took for someone to become a citizen from 5 years to 13 years, the Federalist Party was attempting to forestall the number of people who could vote for Thomas Jefferson, which is to say that the first immigration restriction law in this country's history was simultaneously a voter suppression law. And so, which is why we have seen these things paired together so frequently over the course of history. When I talk with my students, I said, why was Mississippi so racist? And I'll just throw it out, why was Mississippi so adherent to the doctrines of white supremacy, so intent on preventing Black people from voting. And they come through all kinds of like explanations. It's landlocked, it's this, it's that. They kind of go through all these things, right? And I'll say the answer is right there in front of you. Mississippi was the only state, I mean, after South Carolina, it remained the only state in which there was a larger Black population than there was white population. It's numbers. And so, I would say about them, I would say when we were talking about Mississippi with my students, I'd be like, do you know how hard it is to stand out for racism in America? Like, how hard, like, you have to really apply yourself? It was like, it was bad because it's like a really off-color joke, but I was like, like Mississippi is like the New York Yankees of racism. It's like not always the best, but usually in contention to be the best. And so that's a Boston, in the Boston crowd, I don't expect to get anything from that. But that's where we are. So this demography becomes the basis of this concern. And this tradition, we can go through the Electoral College, we can go through the 3/5 compromise, we can go through all these things. But it kind of rears its head again and again and again and again. So how does Howard Zinn enter this equation? Resolutely and defiantly democratic, intent upon giving a voice and an understanding of the social movements that have attempted to move in the opposite direction. And so the novelist Russell Banks once pointed out that America is defined by two narratives. And he said that the fundamental romantic narrative of the nation is go west, young man. It's about the expansion of the country in the westward direction. He said, but the fundamental direction of African-American history has been north, the movement from south to north. And he proposed that there was a kind of crossroads, a place, in which these two narratives, both figuratively and geographically, meet. If we were to adapt that to our purposes, we would say that there is this tradition, this anti-democratic tradition that we spoke about. And as we enter part 2 on the meaning of Zinn, I would propose that we have these narratives that move in opposite directions. An anti-democratic tradition and a democratic tradition, irreconcilable, hostile to each other's interests, but consistently vying for influence and hegemony in the course of our history and our lives and our society. Like most people who have read Howard Zinn's most well-known book, People's History of the United States, I have my own story of how I came to that text. And like most people, I tend to see it as a kind of BC and AD experience. That my understanding of the society, I read the book when I was 23, and my understanding of the society that I was living in, my understanding of my responsibilities, my understanding of the past, all of these things exploded into these much more complicated ways of understanding the world around me. If we were to talk about, in order to properly appreciate the significance of the book, we have to talk about a few public controversies. In 2019, Nicole Hannah-Jones, a journalist for the New York Times Magazine, released the 1619 Project. So the journalistic historical commemoration of the 400th anniversary of the arrival of 20 Africans who were brought here against their will to where they were enslaved in Jamestown, Virginia, or has generally been suspected afforded the status of indentured servants in Jamestown, Virginia. The 1619 Project immediately became controversial. In the midst of the last year of the Trump presidency, a kind of revanchist Empire Strikes Back movement developed fairly quickly, intent upon criticizing and taking down this project as propagandistic, unfit, for scholarly, examination and so on. Had we been paying attention, the conflict that emerged around that project probably should not have surprised us. In 1995, some of us will recall that the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum planned an exhibition of the Enola Gay. The Enola Gay was the airplane that carried the first atomic bomb that was dropped on Hiroshima. And in recognition of the 50th anniversary of the end of the war, the museum intended to display the fuselage of the plane and have an exhibit that contextualized the dropping of the atomic bomb. It generated a huge degree of public controversy. On the one hand, the act of dropping the bomb and the instantaneous incineration of 70,000 human beings had been understood as the punctuation to World War II. In subsequent years, however, scholarly evaluation had raised questions about whether the dropping of the atomic bomb was a necessity, a military necessity, and whether the objectives in ending the war quickly had more geopolitical interests and geopolitical motivations to conclude the war before the Soviet army joined in the Pacific Theater. And so there's a huge controversy. And ultimately, the fuselage is displayed, but there's no broader exhibit. And there's no text that could be interpreted as lionizing or condemning the decision to display the fuselage of the Enola Gay. 3 years before that, we saw the sesquicentennial of Columbus's arrival. And that also elicited a public controversy, significant public controversy. On the one hand, there was a sense of people who had kind of consumed the general public understanding of Columbus. 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. The narrative of heroism and discovery, particularly the significance of Columbus to Italian Americans, and the origin of that holiday as a means of presenting a brief for the inclusion of Italians who had suffered a kind of bigoted antagonism as they arrived in significant numbers as immigrants. And Columbus and his heroism become the brief for Italian contributions to the Western world, Western tradition. There's also the narrative of genocide, of imperialism, of colonialism, of the subordination and slavery that emerge in the wake of Columbus's arrival. And so when we look at this moment, there's a great deal of confusion about how we should understand it. This is where people's history comes in. These conflicts, if we look at them, they have one thing in common, which is that there is a general public in lay perception of a particular question about history, and a perception of scholars and the kind of scholarly dialogue that has moved in a direction far afield, far different from where the general public understands this perception to be. And not surprisingly, museums and cultural institutions that are meant to be the kind of mediating body between the kind of scholarly world and the lay public find themselves in the crosshairs in all of these kinds of conflicts. What people's history of the United States did was demonstrate the power of synthesis. And that book brilliantly and enduringly stood in the middle and translated decades of scholarly currents and developments into language that was accessible and appealing to the lay reader, to the common reader of American history. As a consequence, the book has sold more than 2 million copies, which is unbelievable for a history book. One of the things that's crucial to understanding the importance of this book, appearing in 1980, is that it is both a history of the United States and a reflection of the history of the historical profession itself. And so Howard Zinn has talked very significantly about the way in which his biography, his personal biography, influenced his academic and intellectual life. The time that he spent as a shipyard worker and his recognition of the importance of labor unions and the nature of labor in American life. His time as a professor at a Southern HBCU, which I will talk about in more detail in a moment, and his experience as a bombardier in World War II. All of these went into the framing and the kind of intellectual outlook that eventually culminated in Professor Zinn's work. He studied at NYU under the GI Bill, and then at Columbia University, where he did his doctorate degree and completed it in 1957. His doctoral dissertation examined the congressional career of Fiorello LaGuardia, the congressional rep and mayor of New York City, for whom the aforementioned airport is named. During his time at Columbia, the field of history was beginning to change from the staid, establishment-oriented perspective that of the kind of drawing room historian to a much more dynamic and engaged profession, one that was connected to and reflective of the currents in which the work was being produced. Notably, he does this work in the course of the McCarthy period. And biographers and observers have questioned how someone with Zinn's politics had the audacity to write a doctoral dissertation about this unabashedly leftist figure in American life, and would there be a general climate of intellectual chill? Well, he had the benefit of two very notable defenders, Henry Steele Comager and Richard Hofstadter, both of whom had been avowedly anti-McCarthyite. And of course, I mean, we could have a whole entire conversation about Richard Hofstadter and what he proposes in the paranoid style of American politics, but is also a kind of instructive lens to read Professor Zinn's work through, subsequent work through. But by the 1960s and 1970s, the baby boom generation, the generation that had seen the initial days of the civil rights movement, that had initiated the anti-Vietnam War movement, that had seen the emergence of the women's movement, that generation was beginning to enter graduate school. And they were beginning to ask different questions. They were seeking a more urgent form of scholarship that examined questions about imperialism, that examined the significance of race in American life, that looked at the kind of now classic trinity of kind of race, class, and gender, and those questions, those questions coming to the fore in the work of this generation of historians, both domestically and internationally. And so one of the most instructive ways of understanding people's history of the United States is via the footnotes, not simply for the delectable tidbits of information that are included in there, but the specific historians that Professor Zinn is quoting. And he puts together a synthesis of where the historical scholarship has taken itself in the preceding years. when Gary Nash and Jesse LeMish began asking questions, and other historians, the problem is that you leave people out here. Like, I'm just suffice it to say, for everyone I mentioned, they are a placeholder for people I'm not mentioning. But when they began asking about how the everyday person experienced the American Revolution, and pointing out the distinctions between how the political and economic elite experienced the transition from colony to nation, and saying that this was distinct from the way that the yeoman or the laborer or the dispossessed person experienced this change. When a new generation of historians informed by the Civil Rights Movement begins to overturn the stagnant historiography of slavery, and begins to overturn the mythology of Reconstruction, which had been codified and generated in the history department at Columbia itself, in the Dunning School, which articulated these ideas of kind of white supremacist brief about what Reconstruction had been. And so in surveying the landscape in which all of these changes had taken place, Professor Zinn brilliantly puts together this synthesis of that body of work into a cohesive way of understanding the nation. Now, this doesn't happen without consequences. As a matter of fact, I took note of what the historian Sean Wilentz said, that Howard Zinn was a popularizer, not a scholar of original thought. No basis for this. I think this is the type of thing that people say about people whose books actually get read. And so, if we think about this, the other significant point about Professor Zinn is his engagement with the question of objectivity and the subjectivity of the people who are producing scholarly work. His critique of the bombing missions, the aerial bombing missions that he participated in World War II, precedes by decades the recognition of the moral implications of drone warfare. This is ongoing. As a matter of fact, one of my faculty members, Azmat Khan, won the Pulitzer Prize 3 years ago for her work in highlighting the vast disparity between the numbers of people that the United States government, via its military, attest have been killed in Afghanistan and Iraq as a result of drone bombs, and the number of people who have actually been killed. In order to discover this, she put on a helmet and went to Iraq and Afghanistan and counted casualties and families as a consequence of drone bombing. And so Professor Zinn is far ahead of us in understanding this. He understands objectivity to be a kind of false pursuit. And he makes a brief for the historian as an actor in the world, as a person who is actively in pursuit of a more fair social order. Now, there is a significant footnote that I think Professor Zinn would do well to have pointed out, that there were lots of people who believed the historian should be an actor. We were awash in Marxist histories and Freudian histories and histories of one ideological sort or another. The problem wasn't necessarily whether or not historians would be actors, but the question was exactly what production they were acting in. Also, the belief that historians had heretofore too often created work that upheld passively or actively, wittingly or unwittingly, upheld the dominant social order, which is a critique that bears particular similarity and resonance to the critique that Professor Derek Bell makes, the critical race theorist, about the way that our legal structure operates. It might be interesting to think about Professor Bell and Professor Zinn and their work in the context of each other. Finally, there's one significant point that I believe Professor Zinn's work could have been better informed by engaging. He resolutely and consistently speaks to the importance of populist movements like Shays Rebellion and the Whiskey Rebellion, and the movement to decentralize the authority of kind of central government that might be oligarchic and so on. Needless to say, this legacy has been complicated. As we look at that idea of a kind of left populism, but it has fundamentally, most commonly in our politics, been articulated on the far right. And this is the kind of ideology, the kind of populist ideology that unites the militias of various stripes. And indeed, the presumption that the actors from Shays Rebellion or the Whiskey Rebellion were necessarily the heralds of a kind of progressive politics is not, I think the reality is more complicated than we might have gathered from Professor Zinn's admiration for those movements. 3, final section, a people's future of the United States. As I mentioned at the outset, we have this conversation in the midst of a kind of political and social potential peril. Perhaps the enduring significance of Professor Zinn's work in a moment like this is that he consistently reminded us of the battles we've fought. And he consistently reminded us of the battles we've won. He was critical of the kind of mindlessly triumphalist version of American history. But his work contains plenty of victories. And more so, his work contains granular explication of how those victories were achieved and how those gains were attained. As we've looked around and we've seen book bans proliferate across the country, people have attempted to hide our history at the exact moment that we most need to engage with it. And it's at this moment that we hear the voice of Howard Zinn reminding us from the ethers and in the incredible body of his work that we have won before, that against great and difficult odds, it's possible, maybe not even entirely probable, but possible that we will win again. Thank you.
One more time for Dr. Cobb, please. So, am I okay? Yeah. I want to let you folks know that the microphones here in the center are for you to come and please participate in this conversation. We really want to elicit conversation from the floor. So please, if you have questions, please begin to line up and approach. But until that happens, I want to take advantage of my privilege up on the stage and just get a question to you, because I've been wanting to ask you this from before I knew I was going to be introducing you. You mentioned the statement that democracy is on the ballot. We've been hearing that for a long time, right? When I think about the fact that we're dealing with media, press, disinformation, propaganda, et cetera, is it too melodramatic, if not too colorful, to suggest that journalism is on the ballot?
Oh, yeah, totally. Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's melodramatic at all.
Okay.
You know, that's one of the things. I mean, we had a meeting about this the other day. We were talking about, you know, the fact that as journalists, we're not taking, you know, a position about any particular administration. You know, I mean, I'm making a personal critique, you know, of Trump and Trumpism, but as journalists, institutionally, we're not taking a particular position. However, There are explicit threats and policies that
Yeah.
are detrimental to the idea of there being a free press.
Yes, dude.
For instance, the overturn of New York Times versus Sullivan, which the presidential candidate Trump has said he will seek. The threats to remove the broadcast licenses from news outlets and news organizations that are critical of him, which would also be a blow against the free press. That there's a whole array, not even thinking about the misinformation and disinformation.
Yeah.
Like these are things that are all detrimental to to journalism as a public good.
Does the recent Washington Post fiasco fit into this conversation?
It does. And so, the decision.
Do we need to define the fiasco? Okay.
Everybody knows, right? Yeah. So the decision not to endorse, first of all, it was a kind of strange decision because it's like the dog that didn't bark, because by not endorsing, you create a much bigger firestorm than you would by endorsing because nobody pays attention to endorsements anyway. But not endorsing is immediately read, and I think probably correctly read, as an attempt to curry favor with a potential Trump administration. And that is, we saw previously in the Trump administration that he attempted to attack Amazon and their postal distribution deals and as a means of getting back at the Washington Post for its coverage of the Russia situation. So, we've gotten kind of conflicting messages about the LA Times, but it's not, impossible that their motivation is the same as well. So I think that's what's happening, and it is the kind of preemptive compliance.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That
we're already in it.
Yeah, that we're already in it.
Yeah.
And so democracy is really not for the faint of heart. If you really do believe, and I don't mean like the kind of passive 7th grade civics democracy. I mean like actual democracy. You have to be willing to risk something. Yeah. Be willing to put something up at stake.
So a little while ago, you made the statement that you wanted to not be partisan in your talk. I'm going to ask you to be partisan for a moment, but not politically partisan, professionally partisan. I want to ask you a question as a journalist and as a dean of a journalism school. Now, this goes back to after Trump won, two things that happened to me immediately. First and foremost, one of my colleagues walked into the English department, this is before I came to BU, and burst into tears, which was not unusual after Trump won the first time. But he burst into tears. He said, "It's our fault." And I'm like, "What do you mean we?" But he said, "Education, we failed."
Oh, yeah.
Right? But then the second thing, right after that, another student, and that was a colleague of mine, and a student, he came into my office and he was not interested in journalism at all. But for some reason, after Trump won and he saw what was going to happen, he immediately thought, screw grad school, I need to be a journalist. And he went into journalism. And I'm wondering, those two stories for me say something about futurity and possibility. And I'm wondering what you think about how they fit into this moment.
About the educational part, I think that's the most accurate diagnosis. And I've been saying that. And, the morning after the election, I spent the election in North Carolina. I was covering, for the New Yorker, I was covering the statewide races in North Carolina. And I got an early flight back. On the flight, there were two women seated behind me, and they were crying. And I somehow knew that this was connected to the election. And I assumed that they knew each other. And at some point, I just kind of turned around and I said, "Are you talking about what happened yesterday?" Just the kind of journalist in me. And they said, "Yes." But to my surprise, they did not know each other. But they had discovered, at some point, in the waiting area and the gate, that they were both mothers of children with developmental disabilities.
Ah.
And they were terrified at the kind of bullying that would be sanctioned now, because they remembered what Trump had done when he ridiculed the journalist,
disabled journalist.
right, the disabled journalist. And they were saying that now every schoolyard, terrorist would be licensed to emotionally harm their children. And so when we got into a conversation, and I said, we're going to spend a lot of time trying to understand, what exactly has happened. And one of the women said, it won't take that much time. And she said, I'm a teacher, and we have failed in American education, and we failed in American education for a really long time, and that this was ultimately the yield of it. Irrespective of people's political orientation. Like, that's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is kind of recognizing the core civic fundamental, the civic fundamentals that this entire rubric is supposed to operate under. The idea that we can countenance a potential presidency by someone who attempted to overthrow the last election, highlights the severe crisis that we've had in terms of civic education.
So in terms of civic education and crisis, this is me going back to you being partisan as a journalist and as a dean of journalism. How would you grade the press at this point?
I get that question, and it's a difficult question. I promise I'm not dodging it. Like, the press is disparate and wide and varied. And even sometimes the same organization, is inconsistent. I mean, try to grade the New York Times. Like, you could find evidence for anything that you wanted in the Times. The Times has done astounding journalism and has also done really bad, poorly conceived journalism. And that's been the kind of mix of things that's happened. And then there's also lots of different kinds of organizations that are, under that rubric of media. I will say that I think, generally speaking, the press has done a better job in 2024 than it did in 2020 or 2016 of highlighting the policy stakes.
Okay.
There was much more horse race kind of stuff in the previous elections, but there was more explication of specific policy issues, I think, across a lot of different kinds of platforms.
Because what I was going to ask you is, how would you grade the last go-round versus the previous one?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think that, again,
have they learned?
It's unwieldy, but I think that there was a generally lower. So here's one thing that I will say. That whole first section, the American invasion of democracy, that's the part that we never talk about. And the consequence of never talking about that, of never talking about the things that Professor Zinn talked about, it was like, oh, you're trying to tear the country down. There was a quote that I was going to read. I didn't read it for time's sake, but he talks about when the student comes up to him and she's read his book and she's like, why do you live in this country if this is what you think of it?
She asked Zinn that.
She asked Zinn that. And it completely misreads what he was doing. Like, he's trying to immunize us against the shortcomings of the past by pointing them out in the present. And so, which is what history is fundamentally supposed to do. And so, to the extent that we don't engage with that, we walk around, journalists and civilians alike, walk around with this ironclad presumption that American democracy is impregnable, that it began with a few flaws, but invariably moved in a more democratic direction, and that whatever wrinkles and difficulties we have now are just momentary aberrations that will likely resolve themselves. And journalism is as guilty as any institution of operating with those kinds of presumptions.
See, I've never been able to get over that student and just that passion, that moment where he just, a black student just decided, oh, wait a minute, I've been wrong. Journalism is where I need to go to respond to this moment. And so I'm just curious, and it might sound like I'm holding out for some kind of hope, although perhaps I'm too old to hope for things at this point, but the students you work with, what do you see happening in terms of students engaging with journalism in this particular climate?
So I think that if we're talking about institutionally, like everything I said applies kind of institutionally, that kind of reluctance. And it applies to a lot of people who are operating in their profession. I don't think that that's the only vantage point that people have in the profession. There are people who know exactly what's at stake. And for us at the journalism school, anybody who goes into journalism now
Yeah. Yes.
is very serious about it.
Okay.
And they are very dedicated and very devoted. Like these are people who really believe that the press is the bulwark of democracy.
Yeah.
And that journalism is a public good. And so each time, I interact with the students, I derive as much inspiration from them, as they might from anything that's happening in the classroom. And so I think I don't think that you're too old to kind of seek out hope. I think I'm probably older than you, and so I haven't stopped.
We don't know.
Yeah, we don't know. We'll do a big reveal.
We'll figure that out after.
A big reveal after. But I think that hope is crucial. Like if you don't have hope, then why bother?
Yes, indeed.
I think that we have to avoid cheap hope.
Yeah.
The thing that we were talking about where, good things happen on autopilot. Like, yeah, that's not hope. That's actually kind of like abdication and laziness. But the actual kind of grizzled, battered, bruised but not defeated, valiant hope that says that, as I used to always say to my students, I have the optimism of a boxer in the late rounds, which means if you're still on your feet, you still have a chance at winning.
The reason I keep going back to this student is because for me, hope is always there. And that's why I wanted to know what you felt in relationship to your students. That one particular student, that level of enthusiasm he had for the possibility of journalism, I just wanted to see if that's something traceable.
No, I have a building full of people like that.
Ah, excellent. Excellent. Please, your question.
Hi, my name is Diane Barry. I have a question. It's a struggle I've been seeing in journalism, both in the print and in radio, for about the past 5 to 8 years. I will date myself. I'm 63. I would say growing up, there was a movement to try and present like balanced journalism, that there is, we're going to present something from this side, something from that side. They were going to present them both in a reasonable way. And there's been a struggle in the last 5 to 8 years of what to do with that. When, is it right to point out that one side is ethically wrong or ethically questionable? Is it wrong to present them as equal when one side is a very minority view? Those kinds of questions. And I can see that journalism is struggling with them and is getting a lot of criticism for it and doesn't know what to do about it. And so I would like to know what your thoughts on that subject are. And I'm going to sit down now.
So one of the things that that has happened, I always also talk to my students to say that for journalism, our ethics have generally been refined in the context of crisis. That each kind of development in terms of how we approach journalism and how we understand the craft of journalism has come, generally speaking, in the aftermath of a crisis. And so the crisis that we're in is generating those kinds of questions. At a certain point, it was probably possible to have that undifferentiated kind of presentation. I don't know that that was ever the best way of approaching news, but the default house style of some people like ketchup, some people like mustard. When you're saying some people like ketchup, some people like strychnine, that those two things, you really wind up failing in your core mission, which is to educate the public, to give the public the information it needs to make decisions.
It normalizes.
Well, sure, it normalizes. The other part of it, though, is that there's a kind of allergic response within the media because they feel like they are putting the thumb on the scale to actually point out the differences. And so where the equality is supposed to be is in scrutiny. You're not supposed to necessarily guarantee equality of results, but we're going to check, forgive my language, we're going to check everyone to see if this is bullshit. And if it is, we're going to say it. And we say that this person is 10% bovine manure guaranteed here. This person has a fertilizer truck, right? And so that's where I think we sometimes fall down in our unwillingness to kind of commit to the idea that these things are not necessarily equivalent.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Please.
Hi, I'm Deidre. I'm a grad student, a journalism grad student here
Oh,
at Boston
awesome.
University. Hi. So excited that you're here. I love your work, and you've been on my vision board. So, okay. Anyway, I'm getting ready to graduate this year, and when you were talking about objectivity, it has been one of the struggles that I've had with journalism, especially wanting to be like a race reporter. Because it seems like the only time objectivity comes up is when it involves race. And so as someone who's getting ready to graduate, who wants to get into that type of journalism, those jobs seem to be drying up because of the DEI situation. What would you recommend for us as journalists? How do we grapple with that, or how do we navigate that?
I think there has to be a fundamental commitment to fairness. Given all the things I just said, like this is a very kind of difficult rope to walk, I know, but there has to be a fundamental commitment to fairness. I say this all the time, the minute that an audience member or reader or viewer, whatever, the minute they have a sense that you have your thumb on the scale one way or another, you've lost them, and you won't ever get them back. But you have to have a kind of fair-minded grappling, which doesn't mean that these things have to come out equal on the other side. But there has to be a fair commitment to understanding. And since I'm in such receptive territory, I will tell yet another Yankees story. So, but it's significant, I think. I was in, there's a Red Sox angle to this story too. In 2018, I think it is, when the Dodgers and the Red Sox and Dodgers won the World Series, I was, a friend of mine who lives in LA, at the beginning of the year, we agreed that we were gonna go to the World Series, wherever it was. And it just so happened to be, in LA. So he just had to leave his house and drive downtown to the game. I had to fly all the way across the country. So, I go out to LA. On the flight out, there's a guy from New York who's doing the same thing. He's flying out for the World Series. And then also the actor, what is his name? Gary Busey, right? Just very weird, random thing, right? It's like me and this guy, like the guy sitting next to me, he's watching the game. We get into a conversation about the game. Gary Busey then notices us. There's an open seat next to us and sits down and starts talking. And
it sounds like the beginning of a really bad joke.
It does. It's like this very weird thing. But then this strange thing happens, and it pointed out the importance of not operating with kind of presumptions about how people understand the world. I am supporting the Dodgers because I'm from New York. The Dodgers used to be a New York team. And I certainly would be thrown out of the city if I had supported the Red Sox against the Dodgers. And so I just presume that this guy is the same. Then the Red Sox score, and he's happy about it. And I was like, wait, what? You're from Brooklyn. Like, what's happening? Like, what's the lot? And he was like, no, I want the Red Sox to win. And I was like, how on earth could a Yankee fan, who the Yankees were eliminated by the Red Sox en route to this World Series, how on earth can you rationalize supporting the Red Sox? And he said, well, if the Red Sox win the World Series, it means that the Yankees were eliminated by the best team in baseball. And in theory, they could be the second best team this year. If the Dodgers beat the Red Sox, it means that the Yankees were at best the third best team in baseball. So I'm rooting for the Red Sox because I'm rooting for the Yankees.
The human
Now,
mind.
Right. Now, I thought this was bizarre. It was logically accurate, right? But the importance here was not about the teams. If we replace any other kind of like partisan position, is that people have their own way of understanding the world, and they come to conclusions that on the face might seem to be bizarre to you, but if you engage them and listen to them, they have a vantage point that might actually teach you something. And I think that's the most important thing. And our ability to do that, the ability of the public to regain the trust of the public is directly proportionate to our ability to do that.
Yeah. So I want to ask a favor of you, sir. I want to return to a piece of your question that disappeared. You said something about objectivity emerging in the context specifically of race. That's fascinating. You left that behind. Could you go back to that for me, please?
That's just like in my experience and like what I've been seeing, online with like some of like the news stations have been like shutting down their race departments, and it seems like I guess it's because they want to be objective or they
I see.
or they want to be neutral on certain things, but it just seems
That's the moment they choose the neutrality, is what you're saying.
just at least from what I'm seeing and hearing, and it's very confusing, I guess, on my end, and a little bit scary as a getting ready to go out there in the real world and just wanted to know how to kind of deal with that.
Yeah, I didn't want that to disappear.
I
That
think
seemed really interesting.
There's two things. One is there's a book called A View from Somewhere, which actually grapples with these questions. I don't think that race is the only place where that happens. I do think that it is a preponderance, that people have these kinds of, also probably related to the fact that there are proportionately fewer people of color in news organizations than there are in the kind of general public, kind of representation. At the same time, I think that, there's a kind of house presumption very often that if you're a Black person and you're writing about race, that you have a particular bias, as if a white person writing about race doesn't. And that gets back to the kind of objectivity question, because it's like the biases that are less visible are considered to be, or less noticeable, are considered to be objective. Whereas even pointing out those biases is considered to not be. But the thing that I will also tell you is that for me, it's been important to pick my fights, which doesn't mean I didn't fight ever. It just meant I picked my fights. And we can talk about this more later, after.
Thank you for your patience, please.
Excuse me. Thank you. I was wondering if you might speculate on what you might think Howard Zinn's take would be on this 2025 thing. That's
Project 2025?
And your own. And do you think we ought to be worried about it?
Yeah, I think we should be very worried about it.
What would Howard have to say?
I don't know. I mean, I never met him, but if I was extrapolating out from, from reading his work, and what I know of him is that I presume that he would have articulated this in the same sorts of terms that he critiqued Reagan and Reaganism in terms of what it did to poor people, what it did to civil rights, what it did for the labor working people, and the ultimate implications of Project 2025. Particularly like the worsening and accelerating of the climate crisis, and in gutting the federal infrastructure, the nonpartisan federal infrastructure, in pursuit of a completely debunked and invalid idea of there being some sort of deep state, that has liberal biases and tendencies. That is something that you don't come back from, especially when you're talking about the kind of sensitive mechanisms of government being in the hands. You do not want the entire personnel of the government changing every 4 years, or even every 8 years. There's institutional knowledge that has to be maintained. And that is, I think, one of the least examined and most dangerous parts of that project. Although, I mean, there are very many that you could pick from.
Um, Thank you, Mr. Cobb. Nice to see you. I watch you quite often on MSNBC.
Thank you.
And I like the journalism arguments. But my question with journalism coming from another country, Ghana in West Africa, our education is so comprehensive. You learn around the world. Before we came here, you already know the 50 states of the US. You know he's the president of India. When I got here and I told people I'm from Ghana, this is back in 75, people have no idea. So I have to always say I'm from Africa. But lately, when I tell people I'm from Africa, then people started, which part? So I'm glad to see improvement. I feel that journalism has to be more comprehensive, especially looking at developing nations. We make a lot of contribution to the development of the Western world, the raw materials, the forced labor, slavery building this country, the enormous economic power of this country. I get frustrated when I listen to news and they are talking about global issues. You hardly hear about Africa. You hardly hear about the poor developing nations. It seems the world begins and ends in America, in the Western world. And yet, with what I see from my own studies in America, particularly, say, looking at epidemiology, public health that I studied, you're looking at the distribution of wealth, distribution of causes and distribution of diseases. Everything ties in ultimately to the economy. The economy of developing nations as compared with the Western nations. I want journalists to bring these comparisons. Yes, we have people at the border. How did they get to the border? What did they supply us? 50 to 60% of our vegetables are coming from Latin America. Chocolate that we all love, the cocoa beans, is coming from Ghana. And yet, Hershey, the big time corporations control these economies, and it keeps these people poor. And when you are poor, you're gonna go to where you can get food to eat. So my question is, can journalism elaborate and make messages more inclusive, especially with developing nations and our contributions, and how, to me, it's not sustainable for, say, the Western world to continue to get all their resources, and yet the majority, 80% of the world, people are suffering, brutal suffering, poverty. So, Mr. Cobb, how do we get, I think, personally, I feel like journalism should include studies like public health to really lay the relationship between economic development, where our supplies are coming from. So the average American will say, oh, they are coming to take our job, they're coming to this. We have to know where our food is coming from. We have to know where our resources are coming from. We have to know the role, say, the Congo played in the Second World War for us to defeat Japan, that the whole of uranium was mined from Congo, and these people are still impoverished. Yes. Why isn't journalism including these facts to the knowledge of fellow Americans?
Thank you.
I don't think that's true, actually. I mean, I think if we talk about mainstream news organizations, one of the things that is the case is that there are all kinds of different news organizations. One of the most notable things is that, as we were talking about the community in Springfield, the Haitian community that's been besieged, was the importance of the Haitian Times, which is an independent news organization that's been covering Haiti and talking about the issues that you're talking about. I think that there are, podcasts, there are, websites, there are all kinds of like news organizations. They're not the size of the New York Times. They're not the size of CNN. But I think that's what I was going back to when I said that I think news is not just one thing, and media is not just one thing. Certainly, a lot of what I've learned about the continent and about U.S. trade relations and about all the things that you're talking about came from the fact that, I would, especially in my time as an undergrad, I would read these publications that were kind of aimed at, West Africans in D.C. or that were aimed at, diaspora communities and so on. Now, I do think that the bigger organizations need to do much, much more than they do. But that's probably one of 50 things that we could point out that they need to do. Is a bigger problem in terms of American education. We don't learn about the rest of the world in this way. Is a big problem in American media. Also, I mean, I think for like as terrible as it is to say, it's not, it doesn't probably will not make you feel better, but we don't know anything about any part of the world outside of the US. Like, we don't know about Europe. I mean, there's probably more coverage of Europe because of financial markets and that sort of thing. But when you get to the average person's kind of working knowledge of kind of European politics, nobody can name, what percentage of Americans can name, the Prime Minister of France? Or, I mean, maybe because of Ukraine, people can, think about Vladimir Putin, but or Zelensky, but generally speaking, we don't know that much about the rest of the world, period. And that's a huge problem. Please.
Thank you so much for your wonderful remarks and discussion. Maybe I should raise this a little bit. I was lucky enough to read your interview with Vanity Fair from last year.
Okay.
And at the very end of it, you quote a guest who came to your journalism school who said the following: "There are all sorts of downsides to opening a restaurant, yet people open restaurants and succeed and find ways for restaurants to continue to exist. Restaurants are optional, journalism is mandatory. And so I have faith that we will find ways to continue." I think, to me, both the restaurant and journalism serve different kinds, admittedly, but a form of sustenance, right? One is feeding your body in this moment, and in terms of nourishment, and the other one is kind of feeding maybe your soul or your knowledge, right? I think, though, that the landscape for the existence of these types of firms or work is vastly different today than it was maybe even 20 years ago, right? In terms of the forms of communication, the way people feel about receiving those forms of communication, and so on. I was hoping you could talk to how the landscape has changed, right? For restaurants, I would argue that 2020 and COVID was a huge change for the existence of restaurants, and then maybe a rebirth, renewal, but other types of issues may have formed as well. Can you talk about that in the context of journalism?
Yeah, I mean, the landscape has changed, obviously, in terms of the business model. Advertising has completely evaporated, and some huge plurality, if not an outright majority, of those dollars are being vacuumed up, by Google and Facebook, a handful of other tech platforms. And so being able to find, and then the flattening effect of digital news, which is that how different does the New York Times look from some other misinformation site? I mean, you can copy, a typeface and emulate a layout, and people really don't know, the difference between misinformation and credible news sources. So that's different. The decline of trust, which is driven by some dynamics that are, not necessarily related to journalism. There's a decline in trust in American institutions, period, across the board. But it's still something that we deal with, something that we have to kind of navigate. And so, at the same token, people still want their takeout. People still come to us, particularly in like a crisis like COVID. People went for a lot of kind of misinformation and disinformation, but huge numbers of people were trying to kind of find out what was happening. On Tuesday, there are going to be millions of people who are going to be tuning into mainstream news organizations to see what's happening. And so I don't think that, I think the real crisis is about how you make local news sustainable. Because that's really where the crisis is, and we haven't figured that out. And even if we did figure it out, I'm not sure we would have the political will to do what was necessary, which is likely going to entail some form of regulation. And we've decided that we are a laissez-faire nation.
Thank you.
You're thinking internet.
Oh,
Social
yeah,
media
absolutely,
wise.
certainly, yeah.
Gentlemen, you had a question?
It was a really interesting point about how you need to choose your battles on some things, how some more common impartialities can sound reasonable. I think there's a certain someone who would say, like, you know it, I know it, everybody knows it. Is there a way through journalism to maybe strategically work your way towards a goal? And maybe like try to accelerate until you can get to the point where, something that's true can be said, like, I know it, everyone knows it, until, it's not just misinformation that people are spreading using that kind of strategy.
Yeah, anytime somebody says, you know it, I know it, everybody knows it, I disagree, or I'm just skeptical of it, inherently, because you can't go by that. It has to be like, here's the data point. Sometimes you have to, especially the thing that is supposed to, presumably common sense, you really have to drill down and say, here is, the scientist who conducted a 6-year study that points this out and confirmed this previous study that was done 5 years ago, and blah, 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 blah. And, it really is the kind of, even getting down to a pedantic level, of debate on things. But it's really a kind of asymmetrical conflict. Since we are operating with the presumption that we should be trusted, we only have to mess up once to lose trust. Whereas other people who are operating cynically,
Doesn't matter.
right, it doesn't matter. If they tell you 10 lies, and you catch the 11th one, they've succeeded, And so I think that there's that. And everything that my editor, David Carr, taught me was never kind of operate on the presumption that just because everyone knows it, we all know this to be true, never operate on the presumption that it is actually true.
Thanks.
Please.
Thank you so
This
much.
will be the last question. Thank you.
So I'm going to kind of deviate away from the kind of discussion of journalism. And you had discussed how there's this sort of lack of proper American education, and how that's an issue in terms of the political landscape that we're in right now. How do you think that we, as the people here in a university like BU, can kind of impact the way that the landscape of American education is going to change in the future? Or is that something that's out of our hands? And also, just, is this limited to
There's a whole other thing. I promise I won't give you the entire spiel, but the 30-second version of it is that in the aftermath of the American Revolution, there was a concerted effort to kind of build a democratic culture. You know, what people called Republican virtue, you know, at the time, which was literally trying to figure out how a citizen interacts with his or her government and how that differs from how a subject interacts with their government. How a citizen interacts with another citizen. One of the titles that I kind of wish we held on to was citizen, as a kind of preface for a person. Now, of course, that gets us into kind of thorny kind of complications about people being documented and undocumented. But I mean simply the idea of taking citizenship as a kind of common bond, that we have some sort of relationship to each other in this particular way. Or in a way that, like, if I'm around a lot of Black people, we'll refer to each other as brother or sister, you know? No, you're not literally my brother, no, you're not literally my sister, but it is a kind of recognition that there is some sort of communal relationship there. And so we have forgotten those things. We would probably do well to look at other societies that have had to build democratic cultures more recently. You know, we had to build ours in the 18th century. If we looked at South Africa or Portugal or other places that have emerged from relative autocracy into democracy, and maybe we examine what the best practices are for building a kind of civic culture. And that gives us the best chance of kind of doing that kind of education among ourselves and among each other. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Cobb.